Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in Early Modern History, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm Jana Byers, your host, and I'm here today with Miles Pattenden to talk about electing the Pope in early modern Italy. Hi, Miles. How are you today?
Hello, I'm very good, thanks.
Thanks for joining me for this, as it turns out, extremely timely. And it's timely, first of all, because the book originally came out with Oxford in 2017, and we're talking about it now in 2025, as any minute now the paperback's going to drop, like a hit single. But also, as it turns out, the events of this week have made it much more timely, yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So Pope Francis, nay Jorge Mario Bergoglio, died Monday, just 5 days ago, at home in St. Martha House in the Vatican, which is its own thing, after giving his last Easter blessing. So this book, begun a decade ago or more, has a lot to interest us, like right this very minute. So first thing, before we really get into the book, when I talk about one of the fundamental things we need to understand the book, is the dual nature of the papacy as a universal pastor and temporal prince. And it's this crux that makes the papacy such an interesting and difficult office, right? So would you care to speak on that, the dual nature of the papacy?
Well, yes, going right back through the history of the papacy, popes have claimed to have a range of powers which place them essentially above all other human beings. This is the crux of the institution at various points, that popes claim to be Christ's unique vicar on earth. They claim to be the judge of all things, to have what they called a plenitude of power that allowed them to make or dissolve or change all human laws, and in fact some divine laws as well. And that's the basis of their authority and importance within Catholicism. It's something which rose up during the Middle Ages, was very heavily contested then, and even more contested since then. And the modern papacy that we see today, or we have seen until recently, in the figure of Pope Francis, is very much one phase in the history of an institution that's survived 2,000 years, because it constantly reinvents itself. And it's that process of reinvention which has always interested me as a scholar, and also the way in which popes and those around popes have dealt with the kind of fixed points in papal history, the things that they couldn't change. One of which, of course, was the fact the Pope had to be elected.
All right. So tell me what the Pope's main role as universal pastor looks like.
Well, these days, the Pope's main role as universal pastor is as a kind of conscience for humanity. He styles himself as this shepherd, moral leader, provider of welfare to humanity who, although there are a billion Catholics who look up to him, in his own self-presentation of this, of course, he's looking out for everybody, because that's the mission of the universal church. It's one of the things which has always distinguished Catholic Christianity from a number of other religions, that it regards everybody as within its purview. Every soul is potentially savable for Christ, and it's the church's missions to save as many of us as possible for heaven and from hell. So that's, and ultimately it is that role as the successor of St. Peter, who was the first apostle, the man that Christ charged with continuing his mission after he left earth through the ascension. It's the Pope's role as St. Peter's successor which justifies and validates and legitimates all the other things that popes have claimed to be able to do over the centuries.
And what are those other things?
Well, one of the most important of those things was a kind of arbitrative function, that popes were judges in a sense. And I mean, today that might seem sort of slightly absurd, but in many previous eras, especially in the Middle Ages, but also to some extent in antiquity and late antiquity, there was quite a lot of demand for the Pope's judicial services. There weren't lots of international courts and bodies out there that could arbitrate between disputing claims amongst princes or amongst noblemen, that could work out which of your marriages was valid, or perhaps how you got out of a marriage. That was the most common of the kind of services that popes performed through much of this history. So there was a lot of demand for that role as well. And the third role that popes often took on, the one which sort of is the dual nature in our original duality, was as a temporal prince. And that emerges again from two directions, one of which is that, popes, if they make these claims to be Christ vicars and above all humanity, well, it obviously follows that they should be above all secular princes as well. So the medieval popes, when they were staking their very grandest claims, they claimed that, they had dominion over everyone and everything. And that was not merely spiritual dominion, but temporal dominion as well. Now, as time went by and those claims seemed perhaps a little more fanciful or were more often contested, popes started to consolidate their own temporal state in Italy. That's a process which has its own long and interesting history, is certainly relevant to a lot of the things I've written about, including in this book. But roughly speaking, the most important consolidatory phase started after popes returned from their exile in Avignon. They returned to Rome in 1420, and thereafter they built a very substantial apparatus of temporal government in the Papal States, which lasted until 1870 and the unification of Italy.
Okay. And do any of these kind of tasks continue? Like, what's the modern role of the Pope as temporal prince?
Well, the Pope still has a role as temporal prince because after Italy was unified and the Italian armies took Rome away from the Pope, famously Pope Pius IX and his immediate successors locked themselves up in the Vatican. They styled themselves as prisoners of the Vatican. It took until 1929 until Pius XI achieved an agreement with Mussolini, something called the Lateran Accords, whereby the Vatican became its own sovereign city-state. So the Vatican is the Pope's sovereign territory that he rules over, actually in the same absolute way that earlier popes ruled over the city of Rome itself. And we've seen that, in fact, even in some surprisingly recent years, the impacts of that. For instance, when Benedict XVI's butler leaked an awful lot of personal information and letters, and then he was prosecuted in the Vatican, subjected to a criminal prosecution by the Pope. More recently, there's a case against the deputy Secretary of State Cardinal Becciu, who was also accused of corruption of different kinds, and again was in fact convicted in the Vatican. So there are, the Pope still exercises this temporal function. It's just over a very, very small microstate now, which only has 800 people in it.
But the Church also has an important financial, economic presence as well.
Yeah, the Church is also really still today one of the world's largest NGOs. It has a vast wealth which is distributed all around the world. Now, obviously, these days, the Vatican is not, in fact, able to access and control all of that wealth, that the various provinces of the Church all around the world are actually quite independent, more than one might think, in the sense that the Church here in England and Wales or in Australia or in America has its own autonomy over financial matters, and in fact each diocese does. That's why often when claims were made against those dioceses, for instance in the wake of sexual abuse scandals, it's the diocese that pays and that went bankrupt. But the Pope still has a kind of guiding and coordinating role over that entire enterprise, over all the missions of the Church all around the world, and in fact over the content and structure and ideology and emphases of welfare programs that take place in different dioceses. So he's still a hugely important figure in this system, even if he's not quite like a chief financial officer or a chief executive in the way that he would be in a multinational conglomerate.
Right. So we are in an interregnum period right now, sede vacante of some sort. And I feel like right this moment, there's more attention than ever before. Not just because as we are speaking, cardinals are on their way to Rome, joining other cardinals that have been gathering for some time after the pneumonia, and they're all praying for guidance and jockeying for power. But also there was this Oscar-nominated movie, right, Conclave, which I'm certain you've had to talk about, Burger 2024. That was a surprise hit. And so I'm finding people talking to me about conclave right now, and they're pretty sure they know what goes on in there. Do you have any words before we move on about this film?
Well, I have seen the film, and I thought it was rather fun. Um, I mean, obviously, there are some aspects to it that take a little bit of dramatic license, especially the way the cardinals talk to each other. I don't really think that that's what goes on most of the time, but in many respects, it was actually, quite faithful to how things work out. Certainly visually, it seemed to be pretty good, and it got most of the rules right. But then the book that it's based on by Robert Harris is extremely well researched, and he successfully picked up an awful lot of the little permutations and quirks that conclaves can throw up, including, of course, the famous or the surprising denouement of the whole thing. But yeah, I think that in general, though, this is one of those processes that, partly because it's so secret and it's also so rare, that we haven't actually seen very many conclaves in our lifetimes. I mean, in mine, this is only the third. You have to be, I think, quite a lot older to have seen the double conclave of 1978, and you have to be much older to remember 1963 or 1958. So there is a kind of romance to the whole thing, because you've got all these men in very striking costumes processing into a building like the Sistine Chapel, and there must be, our minds, our brains fill in with imagination what must be going on in what is still an archaic and secretive ritual that we don't know much about it, but it produces this great leader, and often a figure that we don't really know about in advance. It's very dramatic when the senior cardinal goes out onto the balcony of St. Peter's and says "Habemus Papam," and then reads out some more Latin that nobody understands, and we're all trying to listen to see if we can hear the new name. And then the Pope appears. It's almost like magic. There's no equivalent. I mean, an American presidential inauguration is nowhere near as exciting, out there in late January or in Washington, D.C. So
No, nowhere. And we just got to see another inauguration or whatever, as we have a new king this year, or last year, I guess. So that was kind of exciting, but there's nothing quite like, I don't know, maybe, there's something about the ritual, like applying the items, putting on a crown, or, leaving your cardinal's robes behind and putting...
Well, the king's coronation in the United Kingdom, I mean, it exhibited many of the same qualities. It plays on the same ideas as the papal process. So, for instance, when the king was anointed, he went behind a screen and we couldn't see the most sacred moment. That's very like the way in which, we'll, if it's anything like 2013, we'll be able to watch on TV how all the cardinals process into the Sistine Chapel. We might see their initial taking of oaths, and then they'll sort of dramatically pull the camera back, and you'll see someone shut the doors and lock them, and then there'll be a little seal. I mean, it's all a bit of theatre, because presumably that must have to happen every day or every session, because the cardinals leave. We know that, unlike in the past, they now get to go home to a nice ensuite guest room in the Santa Marta guest house, where Pope Francis also lived. So it's all theatre, but it's very compelling theatre, and that's why people want to watch it.
Sure. And there's this long history of investment being very important, right? Are these temporal reminders of great power. It matters. Like, there is a kind of magic that goes on there. So, talk to me about the College of Cardinals. Who are these guys? Where do they come from? How do they become cardinals?
Well, the College of Cardinals is one of those parts of the Catholic Church, and indeed Catholicism, which has a long tradition, but actually it's never really quite clear how it began or on what basis it holds the authority that it does. So, actually one of the things I had to research for the book was to try to think, well, what are actually the first uses of this word? Where does it come from? And of course, there isn't really total consensus on this. I mean, it might appear as early as the 5th or 6th century as a word, but the college in the modern sense only really starts to consolidate from about the 11th century, and then it's not clear, why are they called cardinals? It's a slightly odd Latin word. The suggestion is that it comes from the cardina, a hinge. So they're the hinges on which the great door of the universal church swings, that they're the supports, the brackets for the Pope. But there's no reputable early medieval source that tells you all of this stuff definitively. But the college starts to consolidate at the point that the election starts to consolidate, because in a sense, one of the things that I argue most strongly in the book is that the power of the cardinals, as figures in Rome and in the universal church, is almost entirely dependent on the fact they have a vote in the Pope's election. And that shapes an awful lot of the way in which they behave as patrons, but also as politicians over many centuries. But that process of becoming electors, that starts in the year 1059 when Pope Nicholas II promulgated the bull in Nomine Domini, which was the first one to exclude all other people from the election, or to limit the choice of his successor exclusively to what he called the clergy of Rome. And one of the things which a lot of 16th century Counter-Reformation reformers within the church were very interested in was actually how popes were chosen before that moment. How many different modes of election have there been? And some of them, Onofrio Panvino, an Augustinian friar who one of my colleagues, Stefan Bauer, says invented papal history. He, in fact, I think identified 16 or so different modes by which popes had been chosen, down from Jesus picking St. Peter himself. But this process of the election and the rights of the cardinals to choose the Pope, that develops slowly over many centuries, and 1059 is only kind of one of the key milestones for this. Obviously, there's a lot more that has to be decided about an election than simply who gets to have the votes. You need to have a decision about, how the votes are weighted, what the thresholds are to win, how you conduct the election, what's the how is it organized, especially a long election like this, where does it have to take place? How do people have to behave while they're going through the rounds of voting? So, a lot of the medieval history of the election is about the accretion of different rules and clarifications around this, often when they, of course, weren't being observed, which was why they had to be stated, restated outright.
Where? I just want to note, this method's only been around for 1,000 years. So, there's so much church before that too. We don't know. So what is the fact that these men are cardinals tell us about them? Because that's already quite a career you've had to be cardinal. Yes.
Well, it is now, but again, who the cardinals were and how you became a cardinal. Well, this is the subject of another chapter in the book which we're talking about. And again, that is something which has an interesting and complex history. We don't know as much actually about it for the Middle Ages as we do about the kind of methods of election and approaches to that, because we just don't have biographical information about a lot of medieval cardinals. You might get a name, someone like Hubert from Ostia, or something like that, but you can't really tell a lot more from that. It's only really from the 1400s that we start to have detailed biographical information about the college, about all members of the college, quite routinely. And a lot of that's, in fact, because, again, in the 16th and 17th centuries, a lot of Counter-Reformation sacred historians, took a great interest in this subject, but they could only go back so far. But in the 16th and 17th century, there were lots of different ways in which you could become a cardinal. One of them was through merit and sheer hard work and competence and ability. And there are quite a number of men who rose through the ranks of the church that way. My favorite one is one who in fact became Pope, Sixtus V, a hugely important and influential figure in the history of the papacy, because he created, or at least consolidated, the system of congregations and dicasteries, which we now have, which is now how the Vatican is organized today. But his parents were pig farmers in the Marche region of Italy. And there is a story about how, when he was still a cardinal and he was, talking to one of the other more aristocratic cardinals. That's, of course, another way in which you could become a a cardinal if your daddy was a prince or a king. It was very helpful. But the guy said to him, well, what do you know? Your parents were just swineherds. And Sixtus turned around and said, well, look, if your parents had been pig farmers, you'd still be a pig farmer. You don't think of the Pope as having that kind of riz, but some of these popes were actually, they were very intelligent and interesting men who did some bad things, but also some good things. And they're interesting people to study. And they certainly didn't all behave like the universal pastors that we've seen recently with John Paul II and Francis.
Right, of course. So this complicated, varied group of people who have a lot of different things they want from this office. Yes, because the papacy, this matters in a lot of ways.
Yes, and that's, again, another theme of the book, that there are lots of different kinds of cardinals. There are some, as I said, who are Italian aristocrats for whom this is a good prestige role for a younger son. It's also a way of kind of binding the interests of the secular elites in Italy with the church, which that's another process that has a long history. There are some that achieve their prominence through competence and meritocracy. There are some who are appointed, nominated by foreign princes. So, the King of Spain, the King of France, the King of Portugal, they all have rights for a lot of recent Catholic history from the 16th century onwards to nominate their subjects to be cardinals. So the college is kind of quite an eclectic mix of these different groups of people, and yet they have different objectives. So the Italian ones often want to diminish the influence of Catholic princes who are trying to, in effect, control Italian society in different ways. The French cardinals have a major objective to stop a pro-Spanish pope. The Spanish cardinals have a major objective to stop a pro-French pope. Some cardinals want to line their pockets or line their families' pockets or create enormous client networks. Other cardinals are much more humble. They are, genuinely interested, or genuinely spiritual people who are interested in advancing the cause of true religion. And so in a conclave, you get a fascinating mix of these different individuals, all with different priorities, all bartering votes with each other. And it's that eclecticism which produces one of what I think people should find one of the great paradoxes of papal history and conclave history, that the Pope has an exclusive right to choose all the cardinals. But in practice, no Pope has ever really been able to control the election after his death. And that doesn't seem like it should be logical, because you can just why don't you just pack the college to make sure that your own nephew is elected? That didn't happen. And this is the reason why, that in practice, even though the Pope has this unique right to create them, there are many, many factors involved in who he does make a cardinal. He doesn't always make cardinals that are particularly loyal to him. That loyalty, of course, often breaks down after his death anyway. It doesn't necessarily transfer to his family. So that's why there's such a rich and interesting political history to the papacy, because in fact, there's a constant formation and reformation of alliances and factions and objectives. And that political process has had a huge impact on the history of the Catholic Church and of Italy over many centuries.
All right. So another thing that's very pressing, that isn't so pressing anymore, I want to get back to like what the cardinals want in a minute, but I want to talk briefly about the sede vacante, because right now it is not. This isn't a disaster, right? This we're not. No one knows. No one's house is burning. No one's having any trouble. In some ways, but the sede vacante, the open see is traditionally, historically, a really uncertain period. Yeah.
Yes, historically, it's a moment of great danger for the entire papal regime. Again, when you think about it, it's obvious why this is, because the Pope's authority, all these grand claims to be the judge of all things and the vicar of Christ, they stem from a theological position that God actually chooses him and anoints him as his representative on earth. And the entire structure of the election is designed to make that fiction plausible. So that's why it has to take place in secret, that no one can see it, but also no outside agents can be implicated in it. It's why secret ballots came to be favoured as well, because again, all these things make it much easier to believe that the process is inspired by the Holy Ghost rather than just a matter of mere grubby politics. But the knock-on effect of all that is that when the Pope dies, the entire system stops, because the mandate that he has is personal. It's the Pope, that one man who is chosen as Christ's vicar, who wields this authority because of that selection. So when the Pope dies, there's nothing. And until the early 14th century, there really was nothing. There was no government. The Pope's laws are suspended. In fact, even as late as the 17th century, the Pope's prisons were opened and all the prisoners were released. So, naturally, this was a time of an awful lot of violence and a lot of retribution as people, used the fact that the normal laws didn't apply and that there was no policing and so on to take vengeance on their enemies, those who'd wronged them. Often they take vengeance on the old Pope's regime, which was not necessarily terribly popular, but also it's just a chance for looting. Going right back through the history of the papacy in the Middle Ages as well, there's almost a tradition of Romans turning up at the old Pope's palaces and just stealing the stuff. And in fact, sometimes desecrating the Pope's corpse. This is something that particularly worried Innocent III. And in fact, the famously Pope Julius II, and the great warrior pope of the start of the 16th century, who made special provision to pay someone to look after his body so that no one else got their hands on it.
But there is also, this is an inflection point or an opportunity for change, right? So, I mean, the earthly, the Vatican City will continue on without the earthly power of the Pope. But what happens next with the church is still up for grabs, right? We're still right now we have this moment. We don't know what the papacy is going to look like.
Well, if we're talking about this moment in 2025, then yes, we don't. And it will be fascinating to see who does emerge on the balcony of St. Peter's and what implications that might have for the future of the church. One of the first ways we'll know that, of course, is what name he takes. If he says, "My name is Francis II," that will be very indicative. If it's Benedict XVII, that will also be very indicative. Probably it will be something different that keeps us guessing and can continue writing commentary pieces about. But there are factors that temper that today, just as they tempered it in the 16th century as well. The church, for one thing, still today has to move by a certain amount of consensus and engage losers' consent. It's not quite like the political process in a general election in Britain or in a presidential election in the US, where, you get one vote more than the other side, then you've won and you get to rule and implement your manifesto. Because the Catholic Church aspires to be a universal institution, it has to keep everybody on side. It doesn't want the minority constantly splitting off. And in fact, one of the things that the papacy has been able to do with remarkable success over the centuries is stop that happening. I know there was the Reformation in the early 16th century, but since then it's been done pretty well. That the only real splinter group since the 16th century was the old Catholic Church of Utrecht, the Jansenists who split off at the start of the 18th century. But an awful lot of the way in which papal activity and relations with the wider church have been organized, even during the early modern period, and certainly since 1870, has been about accommodation and finding ways to manage difference and to create links despite of it. So I would expect the new Pope will continue in that kind of approach. The question is, how difficult it will be. Will there at some point be something which is intractable and insoluble? Although right now it doesn't look to me like there is.
So in keeping to our modern theme right this moment, I've been scouring lists, people's the popables, wondering who will be the next Holy Father. There's, a book making in Ireland as we speak, of course. But I'm interested in kind of how this comes up, and historically as well. How do you become a papal frontrunner?
Well, that's another subject that has a long and interesting history, because the kinds of men that are chosen pope now would not have stood a chance necessarily 500 years ago. I mean, we've seen, or it's often cited, of course, that the papacy essentially was monopolized amongst Italians from about 1400 to about 1978. There are only a couple of non-Italian popes who were elected during that time. Well, the two Spanish Borgia popes and Adrian of Utrecht from the Netherlands. So that was a profile characteristic that was pretty much essential. And now, of course, people are talking about an African pope. It shows how things change. But there were also lots of other ones. I mean, it was very difficult, for instance, for a lot of these cardinals from the very highest aristocracy to become pope, because, of course, that would have upset the very delicate balances of politics in a city like Rome. If one of the Colonna cardinals became pope in the 16th century, that would have greatly upset their rival family, the Orsini. So although those families they get popes in the Middle Ages, they don't tend to get them in the early modern period, at least until after it was a bit late. It didn't matter so much. There is an Orsini pope in the 18th century. Then there are other kind of qualifying characteristics. Generally speaking, an early modern pope, or a cardinal, was more likely to be papabile if he had, for instance, run a diplomatic mission to France and to Spain, because then he knew the elites there, the governments, and could be supported or at least not vetoed. This is part of early modern elections, which perhaps people now find quite shocking, that emerging roughly in the late 16th century, and in fact until as recently as 1903, the major Catholic states of Europe had a right to prevent people from being elected. They'd just release a list of names and say, this cardinal isn't acceptable to us, you can't make him pope. I mean, it didn't always work out like that. Occasionally they got elected pope anyway, but or in one famous case, which may be more complicated than we know about, Cardinal Odescalchi, who was absolutely vetoed by Louis XIV of France in 1669, was then elected in 1676, possibly because the letter of the veto didn't arrive in time, or maybe that was a sort of tactical thing. We can never really tell. But in 1903, of course, this procedure ended, partly because it was so scandalous to the cardinals in Rome, especially in a new era when the Pope had reinvented himself as a kind of moral and spiritual leader after the loss of the Papal States. It seemed that much more outrageous that in this case the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph should be trying to say who could and couldn't be elected. Now that the Pope was not implicated in state international politics in the same way, a lot of cardinals thought, well, these kind of rules have also gone by as well, and in fact, since then, secular interference in papal elections has been anathema, and we see that going on now with the news reports that, for instance, the Vatican is sweeping the conclave areas for bugs to make sure that there's no one listening in from any of the different governments that might really want to know what's really happened.
Yeah. So after, but we still, this also is applying right now. We're still interested in, what's the Pope going to do? What is the Pope's position going to be on these global issues that tend to be kind of personal, but still of import, which is interesting. All right. As you know, okay. So then we have the election. We don't really know what happens in there. And this was a secret procedure for 1,000 years.
Well, one reason why I wrote the book over the period that I do is that we know a lot more about what happened in the elections of the 16th century and the 17th century than we do about what's happened recently. That the ideal of secrecy and isolation, that goes back 1,000 years, but the practice of it, that probably only goes back about 150. In the conclaves that I talk about in the book, almost every Catholic power and Italian state had multiple agents inside the conclave. Sometimes they were the cardinals themselves. Sometimes they were disguised as attendants to the cardinals. because in this period, every cardinal had a right to take in 2 or even 3 servants if he wanted to. And, it wasn't so far-fetched for the French ambassador to dress up and pretend to be one of those servants. That's the kind of thing that would happen. And so there's an awful lot of information. There's a lot of correspondence about this, lots of letters in the Spanish Royal Archives in Simancas, in French archives in the Bibliothèque Nationale, in state archives all around Italy. And they're one of the primary sources for the work that I put into this book. There's also, of course, a lot of news sheets at this time. It's a period of the rapid growth of news and communication, and kind of private networks of news in Italy as well. So that's another key source. And we earlier touched on the subject of betting on papal elections. Well, there's a very lively betting market in papal elections in 16th century Italy. And information about that kind of thing is also preserved, sometimes in the Vatican. In fact, if we return to Sixtus V, one of the other good stories about him is that there was also betting on who he would make a cardinal, and he used to go down to the bookies' benches around Rome and have a look and see what the odds were on what he himself would do. Well, that kind of insider trading, not really respectable now, but if you've got a plenitude of power, I suppose you can do what you like.
Yeah, the world's it's just not so much fun anymore, I tell you, for the rich and powerful.
Of course, there were downsides to the 16th century as well, and we should remember that Sixtus died at 69 of malaria.
Good reminder. Absolutely. Okay, so and then after the conclave, there's a new pope, and there's some fanfare, literal bells, smoke, etc. And then the pope has to get down to governing. So what is the Pope going to do in the early modern period to demonstrate that he was a good choice?
Well, the big problem that early modern popes have often is that, up until that moment, they're just one amongst a load of equals within the College of Cardinals, but often they're not actually amongst the most important of the cardinals. Because of the way that this kind of coalition and faction building politics works, most popes who are elected, certainly after the early 16th century, after the period of the Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII, most popes are compromise candidates in some way. They tend to come from, the second rank of the cardinals in the previous pontificate. And that creates the problem that they then, have to assert themselves over people who up until that moment had considered themselves their superiors and their bosses. And that can be a difficult thing for them to achieve. And different popes had different approaches to this. One of them, which I wrote about in my other book, in fact, my doctoral thesis, is about Pius IV and how he prosecuted his predecessor's family for corruption, and in fact had a number of them executed, including one of the cardinals. It was very shocking to people in Rome, but it was a very brutal way by which he was able to stamp his authority on everybody. Of course, it was very risky because there was very little to stop the next pope from doing that to his family too. And in fact, one of the sort of key questions there is, well, how is it that a cycle of killing off the previous pope's family didn't in fact emerge? Well, one of the ways it didn't emerge is that instead each papal family simply became richer than the previous ones, because you don't really have that much power if the other guy has a lot more money. So, with every successive change of regime in Rome, the papal family started to accrue more and more resources to itself, which was very helpful for being able to dictate terms to the previous cardinal nephew who'd still be alive and his associates. But of course, that's also an unsustainable system, because if you can't keep doubling the amount that the family takes out of the system before the system goes bankrupt, and that, roughly speaking, is what happened in the second half of the 17th century. And there were a series of reforms, including famously in the 1690s, the formal end of nepotism.
Yeah. Okay. Effective, but that's way beyond the scope of your book, is if that's an effective point. So I was trying to ask. And also in the early modern era, how important. What's the relationship between the development of the papacy and the development of other absolutist states in the early modern era? Like, I don't want to get into too much detail for our listeners, But, one of the arguments about the development of the early modern era is the ongoing centralization of absolute states. Like, what can you tell us there?
Well, this is one of the arguments raised by an Italian historian called Paolo Prodi, who's in some ways my main interlocutor in this book. Prodi, in fact, died about 10 years ago now. He was the brother of the Italian Prime Minister, the European Commissioner, Romano Prodi, and he was a very significant scholar in Italy. But one of his points was to say, well, actually, these systems that emerged all around Europe, papacy got there first. It's the model for absolutism. It's the model for the ways in which government develops in this period. And I think, broadly speaking, Prodi is right. One example of this, of course, is the sale of offices, the so-called venality, where popes go first and in some ways they go hardest. They sell offices, they sell the right to be a papal official, to collect revenues on behalf of the Pope. That's a hugely popular system that brings in vast amounts of investment into Rome, which is how popes are able to pay their families more and more money. And that is replicated, in the French monarchy and then in other monarchies around Europe, on very much the same kind of structure. I mean, obviously it becomes much bigger in France, but France is a much bigger state with a lot more resources ultimately than the papal state is. But you can see that, that these practices emerge from Rome. And I suppose Prodi's sort of key question is, why is that? And he said, well, it's connected with this dual nature, that the papacy has to square a circle, that other monarchies, well, they sort of also do, because all monarchy is sacred in a certain way in this period, but it's all just more acute for popes. So that's the argument. And that, he was saying, well, we've got to actually put the papacy back in the history of the development of states in Europe and state finances. And when you do that, you start to see a different kind of history to that and trajectory to that than we think if we just say, well, France is the stereotype European state of this period. Everything else is just a variation of that. His argument was, no, the papacy is the original European state actor. And actually, we need to benchmark everything to what happens in Rome.
It's a convincing argument.
I mean, I don't, in my book, I don't particularly challenge that argument. I think, broadly speaking, the papacy should be much more central to conversations we have about the state and its evolution in world history. I mean, the reason why I think it's been more marginal is because a lot of that discussion has been about war and how states and state finances grow in order to finance wars and conflicts. And, we don't think of the Pope as someone who fights wars, although actually, popes were quite involved in military activity over long periods of the papacy's history. But then, I'm biased in my arguments here. I'm a historian of the papacy, so naturally I think it's the most important institution to study in the early modern world.
Sure. Hammers, nails, etc. So it's coming. We're going to have a new pope. What does our modern new pope have to do? What is his mandate going to be?
Well, in many ways, it's more difficult being a pope now than it was 500 years ago. You've got a much broader mandate, which is that the Pope, really actually has to actively minister to the 1 billion plus Catholics around the world. It's more difficult to do that effectively, partly because there are a lot more people that are paying attention, and they're a lot more skeptical about the claims that the Vatican makes about itself. At the same time, in order to be heard and to get a hearing, the Pope has to compete much harder against an awful lot of other claims on our attention, and especially the media's attention. One of the things that Francis did so well, and perhaps that Benedict XVI did so poorly, was to understand how to achieve this, how to get people to pay attention, and indeed what to say to get them to give the Catholic Church a second hearing after a difficult couple of decades. The new Pope's challenge is very much the same as that. He's got to win over hearts and minds, not just amongst Catholics, but also amongst non-Catholics who report on world affairs. Exactly how he does that will be down to his judgment. It will probably look something like Francis, but inevitably it will have some kind of twist on it because he's not Francis. There are various kinds of unanswered questions about where Catholic teaching needs to go, which you'll have to decide on. I mean, one obvious area is over climate change. Francis was a very significant global advocate for things like decarbonization and took a very absolutist view on the importance of caring for the planet, our common home, as he called it. But, the debate has actually moved on since Francis's keynote encyclical letters of the last 10 years. A lot of politics now focuses more on things like mitigation and trade-offs between climate change and economic growth. Well, what's the new Pope got to say about that? That will be very interesting. The same, of course, is the constant ongoing discussions of sexual ethics, particularly in the Western world. Francis had a very clever line on this, which is, there are other things are way more important. We're just ranking hierarchies of sins there. Doesn't matter, we're all sinners. The new Pope will face pressures from within the Church to take a harder line on that or a softer line, rather than to just, take this approach which sort of ducked the question. So we'll see what he has to say about those things too. That's why it's going to be so fascinating watching, even after he's elected, for the first few months of the pontificate.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm not going to ask you who, but do you have a favorite? Do you have a guess? Well, 2 questions. Do you have someone you want to be Pope? And do you have an idea of who might be our next Pope?
Well, I'm a historian. I'm just an observer of these processes. I don't have a particular investment in who the Holy Spirit is going to pick. I do note that there are probably 2 front runners in this election, Cardinals Parolin, the Secretary of State, and Cardinal Luis Tagle from the Philippines, who's the most charismatic of the pastoral bishops around the world. I mean, the interesting thing will be if one or other of those looks like they'll achieve sufficient consensus to get over the 2/3 majority line that's required. If one of them does, it will probably emerge quite quickly, and then we'll have a very quick election. If it looks like neither of them can quite command enough support, then this is a very open election, really, with a lot of cardinals who've never taken part in a conclave before. We don't really know what their views are. Mostly they've kept very tight-lipped because, you would do when the old Pope is alive, especially if you don't really agree with everything he says. So, then everything is sort of wide open. The only constraining factor is that I think, unlike some of the conclaves I study, where in the 18th century they could go on for 6 months, and in the 14th century they sometimes went on for 2 years. Now the cardinals will be under enormous pressure to complete the election within a few days. So that's bound to have some kind of impact. It probably favours the better known candidates, and because there just isn't very much time to assess them and to assess who might be an alternative figure of consensus. So we'll have to watch and see what happens, but it should be every bit as exciting as the movie Conclave for those who are paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting to think about. I loved revisiting this book and spending time this week thinking about it. And just looking at the massive, an institution this old, this powerful, this important, this Byzantine, and watching it, seeing how it's developed and changed to meet these the new challenges. But I mean, there's still a lot here in your book that we're seeing play out right now. All right. Thank you so much. I've taken up so much of your time, but thanks for meeting with me this week of all weeks.
Thanks very much, Jana. That's much appreciated.